The other day, we talked about recruiting for the Alabama Crimson Tide as it pertains to A-Day. And today, we need to talk about the big news that broke last night, with the Crimson Tide adding yet another top 300 prospect, this time the hulking defensive tackle, Jaheim Oatis. This is a really big thing for the Alabama Crimson Tide because it vaults the class to the number 11 class in the nation, and we need to talk about the outlook for this Alabama Crimson Tide recruiting class. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all, so hop down to the comments and let me know, do you feel shades of last year coming, where the Crimson Tide are set for a meteoric rise beginning in the month of April, because that's exactly what we saw last year. And if you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification. That way you don't miss any of my uploads, because I do constant college football content, and if you enjoy that content, be sure to like and comment down below. But with all that being said and out the way, let's talk Jaheim Oatis and the 6'4" as he's listed on 24/7 Sports. However, I will note that I have heard he is as tall as 6'6". I've heard 6'5". So to split the difference for the purposes of this video, we're just going to call him 6'5", and that's tall enough. 6'5", 340 pounds. He is a really, really impressive prospect. Usually when you have guys that are this big at the high school level, they're simply winning with size and overwhelming power. And make no mistake about it, Jaheim Oatis is winning with size and overwhelming power, but that's not the only reason why. I think the thing that really stood out to me the most when you watch him is his deliberateness at the point of attack is not something you usually see from someone of his size as young as they are. It's something that usually takes a while to grow into as you develop into your body. But this kid right here has a suddenness, a burst, and a violence at the point of attack that is very impressive. Now you mix that with him being in a 6'5", 340 plus pound frame, now you have something very deadly. Because at that size, colleges are already thinking about, we can use this guy along the defensive front to instantly fill run lanes. Now you look at that guy, you can instantly use him to fill run lanes, but now his suddenness and his burst actually can turn that run lane that stopped into an instant playmaking ability afterwards. He has got really, really high ceiling, and I really believe that. His first step is much quicker than you would expect it to be, and of course he'll need to work on technique, but what high school defensive tackle doesn't need to work on technique coming into college, especially leagues such as the SEC, the Big Ten? That's going to be paramount in your development. I'm certainly not singling out those two conferences, but y'all get my drift. Those conferences pump out defensive tackle to the league at astounding rates. At the end of the day, I think the Alabama Crimson Tide have got to be incredibly excited because I think this kid's ceiling is incredibly high, especially when he can get in there with the strength and conditioning and Freddie Roach. Freddie Roach and Pete Golding leading the charge on Jaheim Oatis, and that's incredibly important to me because Freddie Roach is after a ton of Crimson Tide targets, no matter the position, and he is being just incredibly effective on the trail. He's a phenomenal recruiter, and it's awesome to see him have continued success on that trail, grabbing a guy like Jaheim Oatis. Now, the Crimson Tide could have a special class up front. We talked about yesterday how on A-Day, the Alabama Crimson Tide are set to expect 5-star defensive end Jeremiah Alexander and then 5-star Peter Woods out of next year's class, but it doesn't end there. The Crimson Tide could finish this class with a defensive front unit that rivaled the offensive line unit from last year's class. When you really break it down and how they're recruiting this position right now, the type of guys that they're getting and what those guys can do, yeah, this could be a very special defensive front unit, and it is only getting started. And it really reminds me of shades of this time last year when the Crimson Tide class was thought to be dead in the water, and out of nowhere, meteoric rise. Now this year, the Crimson Tide class was in a much better position, and it's really kind of too early to tell how the recruiting cycles are going to go because we're still coming off of so much uncertainty, and for goodness gracious, California just started their season. So those juniors are just now getting to play. Evaluations are all over the place. And so I think the Crimson Tide are holding things pretty close to the vest right now. And I think we also need to remember at the end of the day, Nick Saban and staff have their own way of evaluating guys. I wonder how many kids will be in this class with the last class being so large, but I really think that the most indicative thing, if you look on 24/7 Sports right now, is that the Alabama Crimson Tide actually holds the second highest average recruit rank for the class of 2022, second only to Ohio State, who is off to another bonkers start to their recruiting class, just like they were last year at this time when the Alabama Crimson Tide ultimately caught them. To me, the most important thing is wondering how many recruits the Alabama Crimson Tide are going to take this year. They may take a smaller class, and if they do, we need to reflect the effectiveness of the class, not necessarily based off of its ranking relative to other institutions, but based off of the average recruit ranking relative to other institutions, because that gives a more comparable analysis. I always say this last year about OU's class, who fell outside the top 10 on National Signing Day. And that's a little bit deceiving because OU was incredibly effective in the transfer portal, and then they had an average recruit rank that put them inside the top 5. That was a solid class last year, but they just didn't take a lot of guys. That doesn't undervalue the importance of that class and the effectiveness of the guys they were able to get. And speaking of transfer, we are going to be talking about the NCAA transfer news right after this, so be sure to stick around, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, that way you don't miss that video. But I'm really interested to see what y'all think, because to me, this commitment is huge. It just reminds me a lot of last year at this time when the Alabama Crimson Tide class really started ramping up, and that's really exciting. Who are you excited to see commit next? Who do you want to see commit next? And do you think the Alabama Crimson Tide will come out of A-Day with any commitments? That's it. See ya.